historical fact that we have to deal with is the Trump election, and that becomes a reality in and of itself. And that the interpretation of that, I would argue, is a little bit impervious to the data as to why it actually happened. And the interpretation of that, regardless of why it happened, will be that that this is a repudiation of the establishment, that this is a repudiation of expertise, that this is a repudiation of globalization. And that is the political result of this election, the political fact of this election. Actually, I think there's a lot of people attempting already sort of revisionist understandings, many of which I accept, actually, about why there were other reasons Clinton was a bad candidate. The turnout was bad, that in fact she won the popular vote, so none of this actually happened on a certain level.
But that's one of the 5 stages of grief, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I'm so far into denial that I'm not even really sure it happened, and that this might all be a sort of dream episode of Dallas or something. So I can well accept that, but I think we have a profound challenge moving forward, which is that Trump is president, and he's going to create history and politics on the ground, and it doesn't really matter how he got there. And I think that one of the things that he has, and I mention it because of the type of setting we're in, one of the things that he has established is that what we say in rooms like this doesn't matter, right? That Trump ran against, he ran on many things, but one of the things he ran against was expertise, was knowledge, was facts. And what he has done by winning, regardless of how he did it, is create the sense that you don't need expertise, knowledge, or facts to win. And I think that's going to be one of the most enduring effects of this election. And it's going to mean that future candidates in the United States of all parties aren't going to be terribly interested in what we say in rooms like this. So having said that, there's food outside, and please continue.
Right. Okay, well, that's set the tone nicely for our discussion. But we're going to doggedly persist, even if they're obsolete. Leslie, do you think, obviously in a democratic political system, we're used to changes of power, swings of the pendulum. But this feels like something more. It feels like really a kind of landmark moment as far as the way that America is, is governed, and above all, how it positions itself internationally. Do you think that's an exaggeration, or do you think that's right?
Yeah, no, I do think, I also want to, if it's okay, pick up on something that Jeremy said. I do think that it feels like a landmark moment. It feels like there's a large part of America that said, we want our country back. And so I accept what you say, that it doesn't, on the one level, it doesn't matter what it was about and what drove it, for 2 reasons. One is because here we are, but the second one is because I think that Trump as a leader, as a president, will be very different than Trump as somebody who was campaigning. So I think we should expect to see a very different kind of politics, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But I do think that we need to have one moment, at least, where we recognize that there is one big debate about what drove this, and it's whether it was class and a rejection of globalization, or whether, and of course they overlap, or whether it was about identity politics. And I tend to think that a lot of this is about white America, right? Re-embracing that really big part of America that, in some ways, Bernie Sanders sort of held on to too, in his videos of, Vermont and parades and sort of hometown America. So I think there's a really significant identity component to this, and I don't mean center-left identity politics. I mean, we are white America. There's a commonality there with some of what we're seeing in the analysis of what drove Brexit. But in terms of what does it mean, I think it is a landmark shift. Whether that will mean that America's policies look very different, I'm not so sure. Certainly on a range of dimensions, but in terms of America's persona and its projection of itself, I think it will look very, very different. I don't know if you see such a change or not, but I do think it will look very different. I think it will look less collaborative, although many people don't think that Obama was especially collaborative over time. And an America that's much more clear about taking care of itself and asserting its interests abroad.
Yeah. I mean, that's, on what you said, it was interesting to read Bernie Sanders' reaction to Trump's election. I don't know if you saw that, but it was, it was very much a mixed message, saying, there's a lot of your agenda that, I have some agreement with, and, we're ready to work together on that kind of progressive, promoting the interests of the worse off in our society. On the other hand, there's a lot of your agenda that I'm not very happy with. But you could see perhaps an overlap there between some of the identity and some of the class things, and I guess a kind of anti-globalization, anti-trade thing cuts across there. Do you think that's going to be the kind of the big international shift, or how do you see that? That's sort of moving on to the foreign policy element.
Well, yeah, okay. Let me just comment on the identity thing first, because I think that as a fact about the election, you're certainly right that this is really about identity politics much more than it is about any sort of specifically economic factor. I think this was from an analytical perspective, this was a very severe defeat of Marxism. But again, that really only matters in rooms like this. I think that there is, in both the US and the UK, a very enduring conceptual confusion between identity politics and economic deprivation questions. And that is not going to go away, and it has a political impact, I think. And I think Bernie Sanders' intervention shows the conceptual confusion, right? Because he's thinking, well, you've been mouthing the words of economic populism, which I sort of like, but actually Trump is a product and understands that he's a product of identity politics that Bernie Sanders does not like. And I think when Trump goes to one of the ways in which this contradiction will manifest itself is that when Trump goes to have economic policies, they can't match what the sort of cultural aspirations of his base are, and so he will fail to realize their aspirations through any sort of economic policy. He has no cultural policy that can really do that either. So he will, as so many other economic populists have, fail to actually address the grievances that got him elected. And so he'll need to find a place to dislocate that anger. And foreign policy might be one of those places. Typically speaking, you dislocate it onto the Jews, but he doesn't usually like to do that. So he'll probably find a different place, I hope. Foreign policy, I think, is a likely place. This is essentially what Vladimir Putin has done, right? Is that he has a populist agenda that doesn't produce the economic goods, so he goes to foreign policy. I think that this means for America's allies that it's going to be very, very difficult to work with the United States, because U.S. foreign policy will be in the service of resolving a domestic contradiction that Trump has and that he can't resolve domestically. And that means that what he'll be looking for in foreign policy is ways of assuaging and distracting people from the anger that they feel about the cultural and economic grievances that he's not really has no capability of addressing.
I mean, I agree with much of that, but again, I think there's a slippage into an assumption that this is about white working class Americans, and the data that I saw yesterday suggests that he's done very well with very wealthy white Americans, not just, right, so he won't necessarily fail entirely, because his base, I think, is bigger than what we've been attributing it to be. But in terms of the likely, it's a hard sell, isn't it? Because Americans don't care that much about foreign policy. So to suggest that he can actually resolve the things that he can't address domestically through particular foreign policies, I can see that it might be an effort, but I don't think it's going to be very effective. So so it drives him back home again, right? To try and resolve or to address at least that sort of lower middle income set of grievances that he will also need to deal with. So the things that people are talking about are large spending on infrastructure and other public spending programs. But I think, I mean, I completely agree with Jeremy that the United States is likely to become very difficult to work with, certainly for Europeans. Although it's assuming that it's been easy, right? We're assuming a certain baseline. Which
Everything's relative.
Perhaps everything is relative.
It could get harder.
But I mean, I guess the other thing I would say about Trump, and you know, I'm disturbed and I'm disturbed and shocked. I still actually think rooms like this are going to matter quite a lot, because I think that once he is in this role, he's going to recognize that he doesn't actually want to do all the hard work, because he isn't the sort of person who wants to stay on detail and stay on message. And I think we'll see a lot of delegation, and it will depend on who he appoints, and I think those people will get a long leash. But I think that the thing that's going to change fundamentally when he's leading and not campaigning is that he likes to kind of bring his people in, and now his people are everybody. Before, his people were a division, and it was all about cementing that division and rallying that division, and now he's got a very different incentive structure.
So Jeremy, in some of the pieces you've written in the lead up to the election, you identified a couple of kind of enduring elements of his foreign policy amid the kind of shifting chaos of his multiple pronouncements, of which I guess one is a consistent opposition to free trade, and another is a consistent opposition to international alliances. And these are both, from a moving on to the kind of European perspective, these are both pretty central elements of what we see as the kind of international order that Europe and the United States both stand committed to. So from that point of view, it could be a pretty, do you see that as something he's going to be able to follow through? And, can we begin to sketch out the impacts that might have?
Yeah, I think so. It's very difficult to forecast Trump's policy. It's probably pretty hard even if you're Donald Trump.
Seriously?
Because, he's been dramatically short on details, even by the standards of presidential candidates, which is a high standard. He has also been incredibly inconsistent. So you can find support for any number of positions in what he's done. He's going to either withdraw from the Middle East or bomb the shit out of the Middle East, and that's within the course of an hour. So I think one has to approach what his foreign policy will be with a lot of humility. What I did before the election, and I was helped in this a lot by my Brookings colleague Tom Wright, is to try to sort of look back a little bit more seriously at his career. He has a career in politics, or a career in the political arena, is a better way of putting it. And he has had a few core beliefs that have animated him pretty consistently since the 1980s, which is something I was actually surprised to find. They're not the headline, by and large, the headline things that were in the campaign. For example, immigration has not been something that he's been talking about for 30 years. It dates back before this election, but it only dates back about 5 or 10 years. The things that he's been talking about since before the election, since the 1980s, were formed through his perspective on the U.S.-Japan trade wars of the 1980s, which is where his political awakening came from. And it has as its belief that the United States, in particularly the U.S. elites, in an effort to cement their role as the leaders of the world, which was a sort of psychic prop for them, were sacrificing American economic interests on the altar of globalism. And he uses the word globalism, not globalization. I think it's important because it's an ideology. And what he wants to do is put America first. And that means, for alliances, it means that allies are people that you are paying to protect because your elites enjoy protecting them on a certain level. They get psychic benefit out of protecting them. But it's the American working class that pays for that protection, and that it's a bad deal for America as a whole. Same with multilateral trade pacts. Not that this is not a problem with the idea of trade. I think he's very much in favor of the idea of trade. It's a problem with the idea that a trade pact should be used for geopolitical and globalist purposes. If you think about TPP, that is the explicit rationale for TPP. That is actually, and Trump is quite right about this, a part of the explicit rationale for basically every multilateral trade deal that the United States has ever engaged in. And so what he wants to do is use the leverage of the massive American economy to get trade deals which are much more economically favorable in his view to the United States. And that's so that when he says, you know, the UK, he doesn't want to negotiate with the EU, the UK can come to the front of the queue. I suppose he means it, but the deal that he would negotiate would be pretty rough on the UK. And the last thing I think that has endured since 1980s is a real strong affinity with strongmen. Usually authoritarian strongmen, which seems to go together, but the essential element is strength, not authoritarianism. And you know, he went on a trip to Moscow in 1990, actually, and he met with Gorbachev. And when he came back, he gave an interview with Playboy magazine, and I say that because I've always wanted to cite Playboy in a forum like this. So he gave this interview to Playboy magazine, and he said, you know, that Gorbachev's problem in 1989, was that he wasn't repressive enough, that he didn't crack down enough on the protesters, and that he by doing that,
follow the Chinese
he didn't, and he explicitly cited Tiananmen as the right response. And said that really what you need is strength. You need people to respect you, and that's the essence of foreign policy. I assume also the essence of domestic policy too. It's definitely why I wouldn't recommend under a Trump administration engaging in mass protest.
Which may be the only avenue left for several sectors of American belief. Yeah, I wanted to come on to this question of the kind of alliance question. I mean, you know, when Obama came into office, there was some speculation in Europe that, you know, this was the first president who didn't come from a kind of Atlanticist perspective, but, you know, who was going to do the pivot to Asia and all that. But, you know, we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of kind of coming from a perspective where that transatlantic alliance built around a set of shared values, you know, has any resonance at all. And as, you know, as Jeremy says, I mean, he certainly has displayed during the campaign what seems to be a lot more kind of sympathy for people like Vladimir Putin and, you know, President Sisi in Egypt and other such.
Saddam Hussein, King Jong-un, Muammar Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad.
A long roster of these people. So, you know, what does that, where is that going to follow, is he going to follow through on that? You know, where does that leave America's kind of international approach?
Yeah, so, I mean, again, I guess a couple of reactions. One is, I think we have to differentiate between the words that Donald Trump uses, a very high percentage of which are deeply offensive, and the things that he's likely to do. And if I go through the list of people that you just mentioned, I think the United States has had strong relationships with many of those people at different points in time in our history, but we haven't used the same language to justify it and acknowledge it and sort of, you know, lift the veil. And so a lot of what we're reacting to is, my God, he's actually saying these things are okay. It's not that these things haven't been done, right, and haven't been core to American foreign policy for long periods of time. So what is he actually going to do? Well, one question is he going to tone down the rhetoric? Because actually, how you say that you're doing things matters a lot for how, especially people in Europe, are likely to react and feel, and what you're going to get back. So is he going to invest in the liberal international order, and especially in partnerships, and is he going to promote values? It doesn't seem like that is really his game, partly because it's not what he values, but also because it's just not where he's going to put his energy. That's long-term investment. He's not a long-term investment sort of person. He's a can-do American, make things happen. But in terms of, I mean, I guess one other area where it's important to look at, I might be moving on to something slightly else, but you touched on it with the China, is the foreign policy and the human rights dimension, which I know is very important to ECFR. And that, I think, is something that's tremendously worrying and probably and possibly a very big setback, depending on what events hit the US and what events hit Europe on the terrorist dimension. And I think that's an area where we could see very dramatic difference in terms of policy and his willingness to subvert what we think are certain normative standards. But in terms of, partnering with
the war
strong
on
men,
terror plus.
I guess the other thing I would say about, this ongoing conversation about Trump and Putin is it's very different to say these things when you don't have to actually govern a country. And as soon as he's actually trying to govern a country, he's going to find himself in the position sometimes where he can't be nice to Putin. And he's going to have to take a hard line. And as soon as that happens, things are going to start to look very, very different. And that relationship is going to start to fracture. He can back Putin on Syria. He can, back off of any sort of humanitarian intervention in Syria. Not that the U.S. has done that much already. But there will be lines when it comes to Crimea and Ukraine where it's just going to be more difficult for him to really cement this relationship.
Yeah, well, that's I mean, that's I was hoping that we would move on to exactly the kind of Eastern Europe, the European kind of neighborhood questions, the area to the east of Europe and to the south, the Middle East, and the former Soviet space in relations with Russia. Obviously, these are of core issue, core interest to Europe, and if we see a significant American shift in these areas, it's going to have big implications for Europe. Do you think we will see that, and where does that leave Europe?
Yeah, now you're getting at that unpredictability problem. Let me back up a little bit and respond a little bit to some of the things that Leslie said to try to get to your question. The point about him having affinity for authoritarian strongmen isn't to predict that he will get along well with other strongmen. I guess I can understand why you might have thought that. But it's rather to point out that this is how he thinks he should run foreign policy, that he will be a strong man. I think you are perfectly right that being a strong man isn't actually a good recipe for getting along with one, and that this is the sort of contradiction that's inherent in the Putin Trump romance, which is that in the event they're actually unlikely to like each other because two strong men just don't work very well in the same room. And what ends up happening is that at a certain point, respect is breached, and this is what seems to be so important generally to strongmen, and certainly specifically to Trump and to Putin. And it's so easy to breach respect for someone like Trump, because he has, like most strongmen, he has at heart an enormously fragile ego. You all know what I'm talking about. And so this means that it's on the sort of model of the Erdogan-Putin dispute that we saw last year, where a sort of minor on the scheme of things, a minor incident in the course of a relationship that in fact was both sides had already determined was in their mutual benefit, created an enormous breakdown, which all seemed to be predicated on both strongmen's view that respect of them had been violated. And that is actually the dynamic that I would see in a Trump-Putin relationship. It is clear that from Trump's rhetoric, and even from a very realist reading of American and Russian interests, that they should have a lot to work together on. The Russians have had a deal on the table for the United States for a long time, which is essentially, screw these Eastern Europeans. Why do you care about them? We should rule the world together, and we should fight Islamic extremists together. And all you need to do for that is to acknowledge that we are a country like you, who gets to have a special sphere of influence, and who gets to attend the best meetings. And actually, this is not a crazy deal from the perspective of the United States. It's very much at odds with the alliance principles at the heart of NATO, but it's completely consistent with everything that Trump has said in the campaign. And it's, by the way, it's something that Russia has been offering the United States for pushing 20 years, 15 or 20 years. So it's very easy for me to imagine them doing that deal on the basis of great power condominium and a global coalition against Islamic extremism, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other people that the Russians have been insisting to us should be lumped into that group. But it's actually quite difficult for me to imagine them actually operationalizing that in a way in which they don't run over each other. And so I expect there to be big problems and disputes, and what I really worry about is the ways in which that could spiral out of control.
Yeah, no, I think that one is well taken. And, you know, but yet at the same time, as you say, if you look at, you know, where Trump is coming from ideologically, not only is there nothing that would stand in the way of that kind of shift in American policy, but it seems to cohere, you know, pretty strongly with a lot of what he thinks. And so it may be a rocky road, but it's quite easy to conceive of the United States, you know, at least kind of making a start on trying to make that kind of approach work. And I wonder whether you agree with that, and we should probably also move on as a European foreign policy think tank to where that leaves Europe. And, you know, from the perspective of European interests in Ukraine, in the other countries in the former Soviet space, European interests in the Middle East, you know, is Europe on its own? And how does it deal with this world if that's where we're going?
I mean, let me first kind of take a step back to respond to that, which is that in our conversations, and for obvious reasons, we keep talking about Trump, but Trump is not, you know, Trump is not going to he's not going to lead an authoritarian country, right? There are robust institutions in the United States that constrain all presidents. We used to talk about the weakness of the presidency of the United States.
Speak up a little bit.
Sorry, I think you've got a mic, and I know. There are robust institutions in the United States. It's a democratic country. He's not going to have free play to do anything that he wants, partly because of the structure of the polity and the institutional structure of even the foreign policy apparatus. Even in the context of, you know, at least 2 years where he has control over Congress, but partly because of his personality. I really think that we will see a lot of delegation on a daily basis, and if you think that a lot of foreign policy takes place at the level of incrementalism and implementation, then I think that's a very significant moderating force. So I think we need to look very carefully at who he appoints and then who they appoint to sort of, you know, I think we just want to temper our assessment of what he will do in all these different domains. Does it leave Europe on its own? Europe, it leaves Eastern Europe on its own, I think, and the Baltics, tragically. And that's been a debate in the administration for several years now, and I think that there will be, I think Jeremy's exactly right, that there's going to be a lean in one direction. But once again, I think that we're going to see a very significant shift once he's a president and not a presidential candidate.
The kind of the foreign policy establishment that one of Obama's advisors called the blob is going to begin to kind of ooze into his administration's kind of approach.
The other thing that Jeremy said that you sort of embedded in that nice reference to Realist International, there have been a number of pieces that people have written over the course of the campaign saying, yeah, if you just don't look at the photo, and you take away all the really reprehensible, and I don't want to discount it because I find it to be honest, I find it difficult to listen and to watch. But if you strip all that away, a number of the policies are kind of what a lot of realist international relations thinkers have been advocating since the end of the Cold War, in terms of restraint, selective engagement. I mean, there are debates in that space. But you know, investment in Europe, in European partnerships and institutions, and is not something that realist international thinkers have been promoting, and they certainly haven't been suggesting that we should. You know, John Mearsheimer says treat Ukraine as, you know, just that's protected space for Russia. So these are ideas that are out there amongst people that we take seriously, that we don't necessarily agree with, but we take seriously.
Well, look, I'm one of those people, I think. So I'm glad that you take me seriously. And so there is a lot in the sort of, to the extent that we understand it, Trumpian foreign policy, I guess, that appeals to me in a certain way. And I've been making the case for a long time that Europe can't count on the United States. Ultimately, that this is the type of thing that would always happen, and that Europe needs to stand up for itself, needs to have, it's one of the reasons why I'm here, that Europe needs to stand up for itself, Europe needs to provide for itself. Not that the United States can't be an effective ally, even a realist or the United States can be an effective ally, but that ultimately Europe needs to depend on itself. And I think Trump should, and the election of Trump should bring forward that idea. Obama's policy should have brought forward that idea to some extent. Trump's policy should do it even more so. We could discuss whether Europe will actually respond in that way, given the political state of Europe, but it certainly should. But I guess I disagree a little bit with Leslie that this foreign policy that we see is likely to be the most important element of a Trump presidency.
There's disagreement.
Yeah. I guess I feel that that this whole sort of realist apparatus, which Trump has sort of surrounded himself with almost by default and almost in reaction to the blob, is neither here nor there for how his presidency is actually going to go, because his presidency is going to be about temperament and the stuff that you don't like, because that's who he is more than anything else. And I'm just not convinced about the sort of advantages of checks and balances and the advantages of delegation. On the checks and balances point, on the idea that he will be restrained by the institutionalized American system, I guess if we were having this conversation 15 years ago, I might have agreed with you. But what I've seen in the last 15 years is that power, particularly power in foreign policy, has centralized to an enormous extent within the presidency, and that the Congress and most of the institutions of American life have become enormously supine in the face of whatever the president wants to do in foreign policy, and we have essentially by default almost given this to the president. When I was in the State Department in the run-up to the 2012 election, there was a realization at a certain point that Obama might lose the 2012 election, and there was some thinking that, gee, we've created the most awesome assassination machine ever known to man, whereby we can, with very little oversight, basically kill anyone in the world outside of America. And that we are using that responsibly because we are good people. That part, actually, I believe, by the way, but that wasn't an institutionalized system. So and when the people looked at it, they thought, Christ, this is scary. What if we give this to Republicans? What will they do with it? So we started to have a process whereby we institutionalized it. But then we won the election and we stopped thinking about it.
It didn't get very institutionalized.
It did not get very institutionalized.
Can I add something on that?
Quickly, because we need to.
I guess
Jeremy, do you want to just wrap
I
up?
want to just maybe finish on the question of delegation. I think that every president gets the apparatus he wants and deserves, and that the American executive is incredibly focused on what the president wants, whether he is really that interested in it or not. And when you have presidents who are disengaged, and I do agree with you that he's likely to want to be disengaged, generally speaking, the bureaucracy and the subordinates fight each other ruthlessly, and you get a lot of confusion and a lot of outbidding, and then ultimately the president has to intervene. And interestingly, George W. Bush started off as a president who also had no interest in any of this stuff, but ended up as one of the most involved presidents in foreign policy in American history.
Just two quick things.
Yeah.
And so that raises the question of what's the event going to be, and how will the event, right, change the kind of the sort of secrecy that surrounds the presidency. But I just want to say one thing about Obama and his last few months. If I were in that role, I'd be terrified. But if I were in that role, this is where I would put all of my energy for the next few weeks. Would be anything that he can do to institutionalize, create norms, regulate, cement things, create blocking mechanisms for the next. I mean, it's very short space now, and partnering to bring that in. And then the final thing is, you're absolutely right. But what we saw during the course of 9/11 until now, within the broader civil society and beyond in the U.S., was a lot of mobilization around watching the state. And that I think we will see in spades. The next head of the ACLU, David Cole, starts in January, has been already, sort of thinking, oh my God, my job has just changed. So there are a lot of people in America who are now going to take this as their primary task is to restrain the presidency. So I have some degree of optimism. It's going to be a very deep space. And actually, ECFR is going to matter a lot to that broader project, because Europe is going to matter a lot for America going forward.
So we could carry on discussing this for a long time, but it's overdue to bring you all in. So please, because there's a lot to say, keep your questions as brief as possible. Please identify yourself, and we'll take groups of three. You first.
Khalid Nadeem, Citation, Middle East Forum. Thank you for your presentations. What I'm concerned is, what does President Trump mean for NATO? Could this be the end of NATO? I mean, he's been saying that he wants more financial contributions from NATO. The last Secretary General was on TV yesterday, and he's deeply concerned, I think, about the future of NATO. And is President Trump now solely concerned about his relationship with President Putin, and that NATO will be just completely forgotten and
That's
sidelined?
a very clear question. Yeah.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. I think people need knowledge. And so my question is about globalization adjustment. In 1810s, UK experienced Rattite, and then compromise between capital and workers, and trade union and working laws and working hours. And now we saw the neo-Rattite by EU referendum and Trump president. And so how to respond, how we should respond to globalization adjustment, because they live in parallel world, and capital in global and worker in national. How we should respond to that?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Arthur Goodmiller. I've organised political lobbying to Jews for Justice for Palestinians. I've got two questions really. The first one is about what I do. Trump, one of his comments was extremely worrying to me, and it was so specific. And he said, I think Israel should continue expanding settlements. Now, did he mean it, did he not mean it? But as an authoritarian personality, which he obviously is, it's the sort of thing which rings true from him. So it really worries me. The other question is about foreign policy much more generally. With somebody like him, who obviously he's got a short attention span, a quick fuse, he always wants to be in control. When these issues come up to him from the people in state, he'll be presented with arguments. This man will argue with that man. My concern is he will jump to the very authoritarian solution, because that's just what he like, I think.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Caroline Morgan. I work at the European Commission office in London. Angela Merkel's extended the hand of friendship to President Trump. What do you think he sees as his future working relationship with the EU, or is he just not interested at all?
Okay, got four small topic areas there. I've got them down as NATO, globalization, Israel, plus his foreign policy temperament, and Europe. But Leslie, do you want to?
I didn't hear the Merkel statement, but what I had heard was that she used it as a moment also to say, human rights and democracy. So I think there's going to be a push, but I'll let Jeremy say more about about the broader question. The short attention span is absolutely the question. I'm not entirely. He's an authoritarian personality, but he is not going to run an authoritarian country. and he is going to run a country that has, you know, periods where things aren't effective and periods where they are. And I actually do think that there's only so much room. It's a very consequential space, but it is a well institutionalized country in which there will be very serious pushback if things go too far. The problem, of course, is foreign policy, and the spaces where there won't perhaps be as much mobilization and attention. But I think we have to watch the space. This is the most worrying thing, is his personality. It's not actually the policies. Some of the policies are very worrying, but it's his personality that we're all deeply terrified by. Settlement expansion, I'll leave for you. I think it's a free pass is likely. What do we do? I mean, Trump has taken this on, right? Investment in infrastructure, investment. He's the one area where he's not going to take that on is this very worrying notion that he's going to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. But he's taken it on at a domestic level as an agenda item, right? To try, and Theresa May has well. As a number of other European leaders, I understand, have not. But this might be an area where there is a rethinking of how to address the have-nots in globalization.
Yeah, these are totally reasonable questions, but by and large, I think they're pretty hard to answer because exactly of what Leslie said, which is this sort of it's really about temperament. As I think I said, I'm less convinced that the sort of checks and balances pushback will be effective in the foreign policy area. I guess I could agree with you domestically, but on foreign policy, I don't think it will really be there. And his temperament and his capacity for authoritarian solutions will rule. I think Israel is a good place to see that, probably. Again, one of the consistent things you can trace in his thought is a deep affinity for Israel, which is very normal in the American scene, but his is particularly unthinking, which is again a high standard. And you know, I have no idea where this comes from. Actually, I've looked and I can't figure it out. But you know, there was in the Republican primaries system, an incredible effort at outbidding on friendliness with Israel, which I don't know exactly where that comes from. The sort of usual explanation is donations, but actually, if you look at it, that can't possibly explain it. Certainly not in the case of Trump. And Trump definitely got wrapped up in that, and so he participated in that. It was one of the few sort of normal conversations in the primaries that he was willing to participate in, and he really has implied that he would have a incredibly pro-Netanyahu policy, as much as more than any of his Republican opponents, and that would be a big shift. And it would have obvious implications for settlements and everything else. It's not consistent with the rest of his Middle East policy. Sometimes when Trump is talking about Israel, it sounds like he's talking about the 51st state and that it's located somewhere near Michigan. Not that it's actually in the Middle East, where he has a policy of getting the hell out and of bombing Islamic extremists without really much attention for the regional dynamics, which Israel won't like. I think that I'm not sure how those contradictions resolve themselves, and it's very easy for me to imagine this respect problem being a big issue in trying to work with Israel, which is really, from a governance standpoint, from an American presidential standpoint, an incredible pain in the ass to work with, even by the standards of allies. So, I don't know. NATO is easier, I think, because this really is consistent with his, some of the core thoughts that I pointed out earlier. He doesn't care about alliances as alliances of solidarity. He doesn't care about alliances as alliances of shared values or even shared interests in a long-term sense. They are pay-for-play schemes. They are transactional models, and so it is very easy for an American president to convert NATO into a transactional model of alliance. But from my perspective, as someone who has believed in the transatlantic alliance for a long time, it completely guts the major strength of what that alliance actually is. It's not just a transactional model, which is countries doing what paying for each other's protection. It's a recognition that we have similar values in a difficult world, and we should stick together in the long term, and we should be there for each other when is necessary. And Trump clearly doesn't see it that way. So I don't think that means that NATO ceases to exist. But if as one of the things I've learned in studying Europe is that international institutions never cease to exist because they have too many great jobs and too many great headquarters to ever get rid of.
There are a couple. Very hard to find.
Yeah. Well, I figured this out actually when I got a delegation from the Western European Union Parliamentary Assembly coming to visit me, an organization which I swear had been eliminated 10 years before. But I think it does mean that NATO, despite all its great headquarters, can become pretty meaningless. On Merkel, look, I think that Merkel set the right tone and tried to do sort of both reach out the hand and say, but we do have some principles, and that was the only thing that she could do. But I think we have to be a little bit careful here because as I said, we don't know that much about Trump, but he did write this book called The Art of the Deal. He didn't actually write it; someone else wrote it, but he put his name on it, and he seems to refer to it a lot. And it's all about how you do negotiations. And so I think maybe we should take it seriously. And one of the things it says is that if you open a negotiation and you put your cards on the table, you've established yourself as the weaker party, and you've weakened your negotiating position. And I think it's the European temptation to think, oh God, well, we got this Trump guy, he's a pain in the ass, but we better make the best of it. Let's reach out a hand of friendship. Let's send over a delegation and talk about how important the United States is to us. And all these things say to Trump, well, these guys really need me. I can get a better deal. And I think actually it might be better to hang back a bit, to do what in the parlance of negotiations is sort of taking hostages. In other words, creating things that he will want you to do in order so that you can do them later in the negotiation. And to really realize that when you're working with Trump, it's a transactional model and it is a negotiation. And if you're not participating in that, you're losing.
Okay, so next round.
Thank you. Just a quick question, really.
Do you want to just give your name?
Sorry, yes. Dworkin from BHP Medicine. A question for both of you about Europe's preparedness for this. I mean, you could argue that had we had a Clinton president, that still Europe would have to be a bit more self-reliant, pull its socks up and actually make something of this CFSP, which has been around for decades now and is not really sort of producing much. So firstly, is it prepared, and who is going to lead that, particularly in a sort of post-Brexit EU? And the second one, sort of related question, is around trade. So Europe needs growth. It's stagnant growth, and trade will underpin that growth. And what we've heard from Trump is increasingly, consistently, protectionist overtones. So what does it mean for Europe and free trade under this scenario?
Stephen Classer from the New York Times. I had a Brexit question, actually. I think there was some hope that a Clinton administration would play a sort of mediating role to try and achieve some sort of pragmatic Brexit in the way that the US had brokered a bit over Greece and other economic issues. Clearly that calculus has changed a bit with Trump, who likes Brexit. So my question really is it good news for the hard Brexit camp? Might he offer perhaps I know it's slightly counter to his general philosophy, but a free trade deal with the UK, no longer the back of the queue? And might he sort of see it as an opportunity to unravel a bit the European Union? Is that now the direction of US foreign policy, which used to be a little bit in the 1990s and changed? Or will he just not really get engaged in it because it's, there's no big deal there?
David Webster from the Indus Group. On the checks and balances point, do you think that Democratic senators might now be more open to a Scalia-type Supreme Court appointment precisely because of their commitment to originalism?
The commitment to?
Originalism.
How do you think that Trump will square the circle of the kind of pound of friendship to Russia, but extreme antagonism towards Iran, thinking particularly about Russia and Iran being allied in their support for Assad in Syria?
Thank you. And as the corollary to that, actually, a question I was going to ask, can we really expect to see the Iran deal revoked?
I'll say a couple of things quickly and then let Jeremy answer all the hard questions. I guess the first, Stephen's counsel and Rosie, your questions sort of overlap on Europe and Brexit, and it is interesting. I can see it going either way, but to me it seems like that there's a very strong incentive now for the UK to really work to get the best deal and the best set of relationships that it possibly can with Europe, because if it looked, a week ago, like actually partnering with Hillary Clinton would be quite good for the UK. This is a very, very different world, and if I was in the British government, I would really be thinking hard about Europe. And so does it push a hard Brexit? I think it doesn't push a hard Brexit. I think quite the reverse. I think for Europe and for the UK, the incentive now is to be self-reliant, as Jeremy said. There has never been, I think, in the post-Cold War period, a stronger incentive to really come together and to treat America with a great deal of skepticism. If it were, Europe should be pragmatic about America. When it works, fine, but don't rely on it. So I think this fundamentally changes the calculus for Brexit.
Right, I guess if Europe wants to have some military role for itself, it needs the UK.
Yeah, I was thinking more on the economic side. Yes, of course it needs the UK if it wants a military role, and that's really a very big open question, I guess. I want to say something about the Iran deal. Maybe leave the Supreme Court for Jeremy. I think it's it's deeply upsetting from a personal, social, internet, and on every single dimension. The Supreme Court has got to be one of the most deeply upsetting, likely consequences, and it's too horrifying to discuss, and we don't know where it's going. But Jeremy will give you the answer. It's traumatic. I think the Iran deal, but it is very. This is personal and professional for all of us. It's very traumatic. I think the Iran deal is probably in deep trouble on both sides, and this will make it much harder. But Jeremy can tell you why.
Thanks. So I would agree with Leslie that there's never been a greater incentive, in part because of Trump, for Europe to work together on both the economic and defense realms. But I guess if there's anything that I have learned in studying Europe for the last 20 years is that just because something is necessary doesn't mean it will happen. I think the question that Rosie asked is the right one. Is Europe actually prepared to rise to this challenge? And I guess, we shouldn't count it out, but the political forces that have created Brexit, that have created Trump, whatever they are clearly present in a lot of European countries. And those forces all push in the direction of the exact opposite direction of that. They all push in terms of greater renationalization of policy, in terms of greater xenophobia, in terms of anti-globalism, in terms of anti-trade. And so the political moment is not very propitious for this kind of response to Trumpism. And so I would be very worried that they would rise to that occasion. If Marine Le Pen is elected, clearly this has inspired those types of forces. There is a sense of momentum there, which I think may have a real political effect. And if Marine Le Pen is elected, then none of this can happen. On the sort of more specific question of Brexit, I do agree with you that this is something that the Clinton camp and the Obama camp thought was a role that they thought that they could play, was a sort of Brexit negotiator, and even relatively even-handed Brexit negotiator. That wasn't about soft or hard Brexit. That was about making sure that they reached a deal and that they didn't kill each other. And I don't think that, and Trump won't do that. And the reason he won't do that is not because he wants to unravel the EU, but because he doesn't care, because he's not interested in the EU, and he doesn't think that that's the kind of role that the United States should play, where you sort of sit behind the scenes and try to make sure that stability results. So he won't bother with that. I don't think that hard Brexit people should be happy about that, because even they say that they want an effective relationship with the EU. They say that they want this deal to proceed amicably. The dispute is over what is in the deal. The United States actually never had a firm view on what was in the deal. That was why they could have been an effective assistant in the negotiations. And this, I think, the absence of the United States in that regard will make an effective deal somewhat more difficult. Look, on the Supreme Court point, this is extremely troubling. And, in terms of how the Democratic senators will respond, you could be right, but I think it's really important for us to understand. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter anymore what a Democratic senator thinks about a Supreme Court pick. Trump is going to get the Supreme Court pick that he wants, and unless the person unless there's photographic evidence of him abusing children, that person will get through the Senate. That is the reality of the Supreme Court of the Supreme Court politics in the United States as of yesterday. It's completely different than it was the day before, and that's why I think Leslie's right to be so upset about it. In terms of the Iran deal, this was one of the very few specific promises that Trump made in the campaign, was that he would tear up the Iran deal on day one. Again, it was one of the areas of outbidding within the Republican primary that he took part in. There weren't that many of them. Presidential campaign promises of this level of specificity tend to be implemented, historically speaking, or at least they try to be implemented. I think he will rip up the Iran deal very early in his presidency. I mean, in the first 100 days. And the real question, though, is what will that mean? The Iranians already believe that the United States isn't satisfying the Iran deal. The Iranians will make the case that that this is the United States going rogue, that this is the United States not fulfilling its commitments, that they are in compliance. And the case that they will be making that to is principally to Europe. Because if you remember, the sanctions that the United States had on Iran starting in 2005, I believe, when the Iranian nuclear program was uncovered, were not very effective until there was a full-throated European joining in around 2009, 2010, especially the oil sanctions. And the United States doesn't have the power to reimpose those things without European assistance. And if the Europeans decide not to, then the Iran deal may be ripped up, but the Iranians will have gotten the best of both worlds on a certain level. They will have been relieved of the most onerous sanctions. They will have gotten rid of their isolation, but they'll actually be free to start up their nuclear program if they should so choose. So ripping up the Iran deal will not satisfy any American objective, in my view. But I still think it will be done. It also creates a real source of U.S.-European tension, because the secondary sanctions, which are still available, will come into play, and Europeans will have to challenge them in order to deliver on what they've said they'll do for the Iranians.
Thanks very much. We're at the end of our time. I'm not sure we've succeeded in lightening the gloom that some of you may have felt about the election, but at least we've, I hope, shed some light on the possibilities and sketched out some of what might happen. These questions are going to be at the center of our work, I think, for the coming period, so I'm sure we'll return to them, but for the moment, please join me in thanking our speakers for a really interesting discussion.